So we're very fortunate to have Shawna here with us and look forward to learning from her tremendous expertise. And you should have seen through the welcome message a few things to note before we get started, which is that you have all been placed on mute for the duration of the webinar. However, if at any point you have questions, please feel free to use the question function, and there will be an opportunity at the end for a Q&A session. Please reserve your comments to the chat box and questions that require an answer to the Q&A box. The webinar will also be recorded, so if you miss anything or have colleagues that were unable to attend, the webinar will be made available afterwards through our YouTube account. So with all this being said, and hopefully you all heard most of it, I would like to pass it over to Shawna to begin the webinar, who has a better connection than I do. Go ahead, Shawna.
Thank you, Danielle. I don't know if people can hear me or not, so maybe if people can write in the chat if the audio is coming through, that would be great, because, you know, it is very appropriate that talking about crisis communications that we would have these glitches, and I'm having them every time, and I know everyone's used to them, but if you can hear me, please just let me know or let us know, and if you can't, then we'll have to maybe figure out another approach for this crisis on the connection. So thank you, Danielle, very much, and thank you, CIAC, for inviting me to be here today to talk about my passion area, crisis communications. I am Shawna Bruce, and for the next 45 minutes, I'm hoping to share with you some thoughts on how you can communicate effectively during the first 15 minutes of a crisis event. So in today's 24-hour cyclone of news and information, companies can see a crisis unfold in social media with such speed and ferocity that many organizations may actually see their reputations damaged before they even know what is happening, before they're even aware that they're having a crisis or an incident unfolding. So largely this can we can attribute this to the help of citizen journalists who often, and often company employees even, who take firsthand accounts of events and post them on their social media accounts, and they go viral before we even have time to gather the facts of a crisis situation. So we used to call the first 60 minutes of a crisis the golden hour. You know, we used to say you had an hour to respond to everything and to kind of get a grip on what you wanted to communicate to your audiences. But social media has really moved that timeline from 60 down to about 15 minutes. And some professionals would even argue that it's really more like 5. So my goal with this webinar is to address how you can respond in those first 15 minutes in a crisis to start owning your narrative, and how to take accountability for the event and what you can do from the planning and the preparation stage before a crisis to start responding in 15 minutes. Now, if people cannot hear me, then we're going to need to sort of manage that a bit there.
Shawna, I'm seeing that lots of people can hear, so I think you're good.
All right, we're good to go. Okay. So I know with the people that we have on this call and the companies who are represented here today that all of you have emergency response plans in place. But what I don't know is how many of you have effective crisis communications plan as part of that ERP. Is it up to date? And more importantly, could you really get through and use it as a guide in a real crisis? So here's a bit of an analogy for you. We're entering the football season, and so I want you to think a little bit here on your own, just in your own space, how a football game is like crisis communications planning. Well, I'm going to tell you. We know that football teams who come to the game without a solid game plan normally lose, right? They lose the game. We can be the armchair coaches, we can blame the players, but at the end of the day, the game requires players to be prepared to perform in their positions on the field. They have to practice those positions, and they need a game plan. And the same can be said for crisis communications. If you're not preparing by having gone through the process of effective crisis communications planning before an event strikes, you're going to likely fail to effectively manage that crisis. That's really the end state. Nobody wants a crisis to happen, but when it does, you want to come out of it like a Super Bowl champion. Your success and your failure is going to be judged on how well you communicated during that crisis event. The reality is that you can have managed the best response in the world, but if you don't communicate about how you responded and share that with your publics and your audiences, your public will consider it an epic fail. Now, I want to share some good news with you. The news is that much of this work can be done in advance. 95% of your crisis communication planning is done before the crisis. You actually only spend about 5% of the time in the crisis mode delivering that messaging. And with an effective crisis communications plan, you have the necessary messaging and templates, the checklists or lists of contacts, any kinds of approvals, all outlined in advance. And all of this saves you time. And time is a valuable commodity in a crisis. It's like an insurance policy. You pay into it with your time to prepare one little bit at a time, and you hope you never really need it. But boy, are you happy to have it when a crisis does hit you. So what I hope to do in this next 40 minutes is to give you some points to ponder about the effectiveness of your plan today so that you have the confidence that it can help you respond to an incident in 15 minutes should one strike tomorrow. So when responsible care started over 30 years ago, they did so to improve the image of the chemical sector and how the chemical industry was perceived by the public. We had experienced some catastrophic events during that time. But let's consider for a moment, when we look at the timeline here, that Bhopal was probably still one of the most known, that had the most catastrophic loss of fatalities ever. But back when that happened in the 80s, it took 24 hours for a fax to arrive at the headquarters in the US from the site in India. 24 hours. So now if you think about this in today's context with social media, it probably is going to take about 24 seconds. So we've made, across the industry, there's lots of process safety improvements in the way that chemicals are manufactured and transported and handled, but we still see incidents happening across the globe. Perhaps to non-responsible care companies, but they are happening. And the fact they are happening puts the spotlight on all of the chemical industry. So these events that you see in front of you, they're simply the ones that I found dating back to April this year, just this quarter alone. So I think we have to, my point here is that people think it's not going to happen to us. We have all the systems and protocols in place, but the risk is still there. It's happening around the globe here. We're seeing fatalities. I think last year, I want to say it was over 64,000 people were impacted by chemical disasters. So they are happening. And just like we put layers of protection in place against a major crisis event happening at a manufacturing site, we need to put the same layers of protection in place to protect our reputation and brand of our site communities and to be prepared to communicate when that crisis does occur. So let's pretend you work for this company in Toronto. You arrive at the office, you're responding to your inbox full of emails, and all of a sudden you hear commotion and a fire alarm. And that's what it was like just a few weeks ago in Toronto for a Toronto-based chemical company. In fact, this chemical plant was 10 minutes from where my daughter went to walk her dog and was told at the time she couldn't walk the dog because there'd been a chemical explosion. So of course, like any good daughter whose mom works in this industry, she immediately texted me and said, "Mom, what's going on in Toronto?" Because of course I should know that right away. My point is there was no public information put out. This company is not a CIAC member, as far as I know, and I knew this even before checking on the website of CIAC because there was no information about the fire anywhere. Nothing on social media, nothing on their website. To this day, there is nothing acknowledging the event. No spokesperson came forward. It was all done by the deputy fire chief. And when I think about the accountability code that responsible care members fall under, our companies would understand the need to provide public information. They would be open and transparent, at least I hope they would be, and take a really visible lead in sharing this information. Instead, this company really chose just to decline comment. You can see in the white there that they had a woman that answered the phone and she declined further comment. She didn't really give any comment, really. She just acknowledged they'd had a fire. So this event killed a person, it killed an employee and injured several others. At least that's what the social media told me, because I couldn't find a valid statement anywhere. And so it's still likely under investigation. But what was interesting to me is that they never once took ownership of their narrative about this event, even after they had a fatality of one of their own people. The media and the public continued to speculate about what had happened and how many were impacted. Now, this is not how our CIC members would respond, but this is the reality of what happened here. And when we see that happening with one member of our industry, it kind of puts a bit of a paling veil over the rest of us, right? It sort of sheds light on all of us, and people start to group us together. And this is why we need, as in this sector and in all industries, to be really open and transparent with the publics around us. We could talk for hours about that social license to operate, those license renewals for expansion, all of those things. But at the end of the day, if you are living near this facility and they don't communicate when something this big happens, if you're a resident, you need to be asking some really hard questions. So I want you to go back to your office in Toronto for a moment and virtually feel about the atmosphere. So you're in your office, you hear that there's a commotion, there's a fire alarm. What is it like those first 15 minutes of that crisis for those people that are in that situation in situ? Well, I don't know how, they were thinking, but I do know from my own experience and working with some of you even on this call, that what happens at the beginning of an incident, what's happening around you, how you start to feel about it, and how you start to work through that fog of a crisis. And you start to see these things, right? You start to see confusion, what's happening, there's alarms going off, social media starts to light up, there might even be misinformation shared about your event because you haven't even had a chance to grip what is happening. Others are talking about your company online. There starts to be questions and concerns. There's a lack of information. Your leadership starts calling, because that's always good, right? When they start calling from, oh, we heard something happened on social media, and you're not even on top of it yet. Your employees are kind of in the dark. They don't know what's going on because you haven't told them anything yet. And your team starts to get nervous, right? And that's a natural reaction. If you're not nervous going into a crisis situation, then maybe it's not the day to be there a little bit, because there's a lot riding on you for brand and reputation of your company to be out there and responding to this crisis. And the spotlight is definitely on you to perform. So to work through what I would call this fog of a crisis, you need a crisis response structure in place, and you need a plan to manage that onslaught of requests and competing priorities. So even though you're feeling like this, if you're prepared and you have what we're going to talk about in the next few slides, it's going to feel a whole lot better than if you walk in blindsided with nothing to guide you. So today's need for speed absolutely applies to these crisis events, as we've said before. So the first thing you want to do when this crisis hits in those first 15 minutes is you want to be taking accountability. You want to be getting your information out first and owning your narrative right from the beginning. You want to be getting it out fast as you can on whatever platforms you have available to you. So for some of you, this may be an Everbridge or a public notification system. Others, it may be your social media platforms. You want to get some information out that just says, and we'll talk about it, that you're experiencing an incident. You don't even know how big it is yet, and you may be able to stand down in another 2 hours, but right now you're dealing with something. So you want to get it out fast. You want to start checking your facts as quickly as you can, because you need to be verifying information as it comes in. You want to be frequent with those communications. So as soon as you start putting information out and feeding that information beast, you need to continue doing that. And you also want to be following up on any promises you make. If you say, oh, we're going to provide an update in 2 hours, oh, we're going to do a news conference in 3 hours, oh, we're going to put a highlighted photos of the event on our social media pages, then you have to follow through in doing it. If you're saying you're doing it, you have to deliver on what you committed to. And by doing these things at the beginning of a crisis, you're starting to establish that your company is a trusted source of information. You're starting to take accountability for what happened, and you're demonstrating actions to resolve it. So this in turn is helping protect your brand and your corporate reputation. So when we talk about this, oh, that's really interesting how that just bump slides on me there. Let me just see here. So there we go. So there we go. Here we go. So what are you doing in these 15 minutes? So what happens here is, I know that a lot of you here have experienced a crisis in the workplace, and you know firsthand, especially if you're a communicator, that as a public information officer in your emergency operations center or your emergency coordination center, it takes time to do your main job. And for a communicator in that role, that is to gather the information, to verify what happened, to coordinate it with people that are going to need to know this information, and to disseminate it out. And you have to do all of those 4 steps before you make information public. The challenge today is we don't have that big luxury of time anymore. Social media has given our audiences a way to communicate before we can get this information together. And oftentimes, as I said, we're learning about this crisis from our publics. The narrative has started, and regrettably, we don't own it. So we started to see, you know, when I talk about that, about people that are nearby, they happen to be passing by the fence line, and sometimes even our own people. I've seen this even when I was at Dow, we saw with other companies where there'd be horrific events. I remember one specifically in Argentina of explosion and a number of fatalities. And the sad reality was employees were taking pictures and posting it on social media. Like, what a horrific way to find out that you've lost a loved one through that process, through social media, instead of the next of kin notification kind of process that many of you have in place or should have in place. So the idea with this is, it's never a bad idea to be checking your social media policies to see if you've covered off what employees can and cannot share on their personal social media pages. You know, even if you back it up with, if something happened to you on the site, you wouldn't want your family learning this from social media or our Facebook page. So it's sort of giving them the idea and setting the foundation of a responsible response, for lack of a better way to say that, of a way that next of kin notifications happen. And it also helps you manage the release of information so that it's not going out just willy-nilly by people on your site. So just a sidebar there to be checking on that. So if you are prepared, what can you do in these first 15 minutes? Well, let's talk about that. The first thing you're going to do is issue a holding statement. This is a best practice, and it needs to be in your plan, because what it says is, we've got this. This is our crisis, and it lets your audiences know where they come for updates. So, and a really great thing to do, something I did at Dow just before, not before I retired, was getting your legal team to approve it. So making it generic enough that even the lawyers are happy and they know you can launch this at the beginning of a crisis without waiting for someone to approve it, because it's so generic, it's not really saying anything. So when you use these, you want to make sure it just has that. It buys you time, first of all. It's buying you time. Not a ton of time, but it's buying you some time. It's including only that general information, as I mentioned, and it's also prepared in advance, so it's ready to launch. So what I'm saying here is that, you want to get this out initially while you're still trying to understand even what's going on, because you've got lights and sirens, or there's been a big explosion, or there's a humongous flare that's really visible. So you're putting out this holding statement in whatever way you can manage it while you're going to gather the facts, because it's not sharing anything about an actual incident. It's just saying you are investigating one. And the idea is, once you've got this holding statement done, and I'm going to show you an example. Here's one here. Here's an example, and I'm going to click through these different elements of it to show you what's in here. But this is sort of an example. You want to say who you are. It's amazing how many companies go out on social media and they make the assumption that because it's their Twitter handle or whatever, that people just know it's from them. But your message is going to be used on different platforms. So you need to tell people who you are. This is coming from Acme Chemical, right here. We're the credible source. So it's coming from the company. It's not a third party sharing that information. Then you want to tell them the date and the time on every message. You start it with your holding statement, and then you date and timestamp every message that comes out following, so that people know they have the most up-to-date message, right? Because people, your social media feeds or however you're receiving your information, there's delays in delivery, and you want to make sure you're always giving them the most current. You also want to make sure that you're telling them where. So I don't know why that arrow moved, but it should be at the Daisy Lane site. So you want to tell them where the event is unfolding. Maybe you're a global company, you have sites all over the world. You need to let them know this is happening actually in your backyard. Situate it for them. You also want to make sure that you tell them where you're going to be posting the updates. You want this to be on your Twitter and Facebook pages or wherever you're putting it. So you want to make sure you're telling them where you're going to find more information going forward, like that initial statement coming out in the next 30 to 60 minutes. And then you also want to make sure that, and I am sorry because, you know, when I did this, all of those arrows were actually aligned where they're supposed to be. And now I'm looking at them and it's a bit of a puzzle there. But that arrow should be over by Acne Daisy. And what I'm saying there is, it is a great idea to consider determine your hashtags in advance. So BC Fire does this, BC Fire, then they change it, BC Fire Lytton, whatever it may be, BC Tornado, just from their emergency management perspective. But think about that. You want to own your hashtag. Maybe you don't want it to read Acme Daisy, you know, Acme explosion, Acme fatalities. This is what's going to happen if you let the public take control of those hashtags. So think about what those pre-approved ones might look like and have them in your plan. The next thing you want to do after you've kind of done that first step is getting that holding statement out, is to activate your crisis comms plan. Now, when I'm saying this is that it's interesting because lots of people don't have the authority to actually activate their plan. And this is something I think is really important. It's an important element for right at the beginning of your plan. It should be signed off by your leadership saying that this is the crisis communications plan for Acme Chemical. It is to be used with, you know, we will be promoting open and transparent communications, and it is to be used at the onset of any crisis as determined by whomever you want to give that authority to. So it's probably your communications person who has the most visibility on your social media feeds and will track what is happening before it gets up to a corporate level, right, to a leader. So you don't want them waiting to get all the details an hour later of what happened. You want that holding statement out right away. And that holding statement should be on their phone, on their desktop, in the plan, anywhere that they will be, because I can guarantee you it's not going to be when they're sitting in the office with it neatly available in a folder. It's going to be when they're at their daughter's soccer game and they're trying to manage it from the field. This is how these crises unfold. So my point is, once you get that authority to activate the plan, then you can start communicating without, you know, and I'm not saying you're doing it without approval, because I know that makes leaders nervous. I'm just saying the very initial generic holding statement. Then you're starting to gather your team together. You're getting that crisis response team. Hopefully you've got them on your public alert system in a quick email out or some way to reach them quickly, so you're not doing a phone tree. That's so antiquated. You know, one person doesn't answer, then the next person doesn't get called. It's a nightmare. So make sure you have a way to reach them quickly. And then start that information gathering, phoning into the people that you need to. You know what your process is to gather information, and make the crisis your priority. It's amazing to me how many people will wait to see how big it is before they decide, oh, I need to engage. No. Everything stops until you get an idea of what you're dealing with. It is always easier to send people home and scale back than to scale up in a crisis. Bring everyone you need and then spell them off if you don't need them. But let's start making it a priority. The next thing you want to do is you need to be thinking about who needs to be informed about this incident. You know, is it impacting your near neighbors? Who are the stakeholders it's impacting? Do you think you're going to need the mayor involved because you're going to have to evacuate people and you're going to need help at an evacuation center? How are you managing that? And how are you reaching them? And remember about your internal audience, those poor forgotten employees that have been left without any information because we often get so committed to the external facing communications, we forget about the people right on our own sites or right in our offices. And the reality is that they're your best ambassadors, because they're only your internal audience till they leave the site and they go to Safeway to do the groceries. If you give them the same information that you're sharing publicly, they can help, you know, disseminate information as needed. You know, and I always like to say, test your messages. And I know that sounds crazy, but if you're doing evacuation or shelter in place messaging and it's in your book and you've at least got a draft, I'm not saying you're using it verbatim, but it's always easier to edit a draft than to start from scratch. So if you're starting with this, what you may want to do is actually test it with if you have a community advisory panel, if you have, your different organizations in the community that you have relationships with, use them as a mini focus test for your messages. Even if you're in your emergency ops center and you have messages to the public, we get tunnel vision when we write. Take that message, take the 30 seconds and walk it down to Jane in HR or Jane at security, Joe at security, and just say, does this message make sense to you? This is how we make sure we're getting messages that resonate. And then also understand your next of kin protocols. I know it's a touchy subject, but it is never a bad idea to have a draft next of kin letter or message when you're dealing with a fatality in your plan. You pray you never have to use it, but in some training I did with a refinery a couple years ago, it took us 2 hours to come upon the right words to use when dealing with a fatality. And you don't have that luxury of time. But if you can have some words written on paper and take those to your leadership and have them wordsmith it with their own take on it, you are going to be 100 times ahead of where you were starting from scratch. So the idea there is time spent on this now is a good investment. So you want to know who's going to be informed, and you want to think about also in this how you're going to reach them. So it's not just so much who the audience is, but where they located and how are they getting their information. Right? So these are all things that can be done ahead of time. You also want to determine who your spokespersons are going to be and brief them on what's happening. So review their training tips, begin preparing key messages for them to deliver. They likely aren't going to be communicating until you've got some verified information, but you still want them to know they're going to be on the hot seat. So, if you're 15 minutes away from the site, we might need you here. If you're in your gym clothes because you're at your kid's soccer game, we need you in a jacket and tie. We need you, you're representing our company, or your shirt or a collared shirt or whatever it is that is setting the tone for your organization. Gather any subject matter experts that they may need. If a site leader doesn't have a particular expertise in one area, then make sure they've got people that do, that can help them walk through it, and start talking through how you're going to explain your situation to the public. They don't understand engineering speak. So you're going to need to make it something they understand. Your spokesperson also needs to kind of match the situation by either, you don't want them to under respond to questions or to over respond. They have to be able to work on their feet and be available to answer the key messages you want out there. They also need to be showing humanity and compassion and empathy and concern for any human toll that's been taken, and mean it. You need to make people your first priority. The spokesperson needs to come across as empathetic so that he becomes your trusted source for information. So those are the first 4 things, right, that we've done there. And last but not least, you're starting to communicate. You're doing this with your holding statement, but you're going to start to communicate with those internal audiences, your employees. You're going to consider if you need to post a quick statement. Maybe you've got more information now and you can put a little more statement up from the site leader that says, yes, we've responded with our on-site fire brigade. Whatever you want it to be, but something simple before you get into a full initial statement. Use your website as an information hub. This is something that I think is always interesting. You're limited on what you can put on social media, right? And your characters on Twitter. But your website is like this hub of information. You can be putting your news release on Twitter and linking it back to your website where all your information is, your backgrounders, your maps to your site for media, your MSDS sheets for the chemical, explaining that. The idea here is, to be considering a dark site, we used to call it, or a microsite or a cloud that you can pre-populate beforehand and having all the information there, which makes it really easy in a real crisis, especially since you already know many of your worst case scenarios. You also want to be contacting those, when you're contacting your employees, you're also going to be thinking about if you have board of directors, community advisory panels, shareholders, any other key audiences at this time. Communicate what you're going to share publicly, but just before you do it, right? Keep them in the loop because, again, a board of directors is a great set of ambassadors for your company. but give the information out just before you're going to send it out publicly, and direct the public to your website. And then when you start communicating, make sure to correct any errors, keep the facts out there, and make sure that you keep feeding that beast. Don't leave it for 2 hours. Even if you have no new information, your public is watching you, so you can be saying with a new picture or with just a new statement, we still have, you know, the local fire brigade, fire and police on site helping us assess the situation, blah, blah, blah. You know, you don't have to even give new news. You just have to maybe reword it in a way that lets them know that you're out there. They want to know that you're still responding to this crisis, and they don't know that unless you tell them. So these are all things that can be done for you right at the beginning. I know it sounds crazy, so how do you manage that? You know, okay, Shawna, that's great, but you've talked more than 15 minutes and we haven't actioned anything. Once you start getting that out there, the beginning, the holding statement, that's when your real work is starting to begin. You're verifying all your details and developing an initial statement. You're monitoring and listening to those social media channels for updates or to correct misinformation if you need to, if people have the wrong, like say you're evacuating and everyone's going to the Garrison in Edmonton, but they're actually supposed to go to the Dallas Centennial Center. You may have to correct misinformation in there. You want to be able to respond to questions and correct information, and you want to be able to review and adjust your ways of communicating as needed. So maybe you use social media and no one's getting the information, and you know this because they're all evacuating the wrong direction. Well, maybe you have to come up with another way. Maybe it has to be a sign on the side of the road. I learned something the other day about evacuations, actually. I learned from a person, I was running a course at NATE, and we were talking about, I said, I thought it was strange that in the evacuation notice, nobody said where they were going. You told these people to evacuate, but no one said where they were heading. And it was interesting because they said, you know, we do that on purpose because what ends up happening is people that aren't in an evacuation zone show up at these centers and they start bringing donations. That's a whole other discussion and webinar, but what to do with donations in a crisis. And I thought it was really interesting because they said, once people are on the road, there's really only, we tell them what road to take, and we have people standing there and telling them where to go, you know, individually and stopping cars, which I thought was interesting. So what have we said here? So in those first 15 minutes, we are starting with, you know, that holding statement's getting out there. You're activating your plan. You're identifying the audiences and who are going to need to hear these messages from you. You're selecting your spokesperson, and you're starting to communicate. So is this really possible? Like, can you really respond in 15 minutes? And I'm going to say yes, because, you know, I wrote this webinar, so of course I have to be endorsing this. But at the end of the day, if your company is crisis ready, and that's a term coined by Melissa Agnes, who's a great crisis communicator. And this is where it's not just the communications team here. This is how your leadership, how your crisis response team, how that whole system is functioning. You can have the best comms team with the best plan in the world, but if your crisis response team is broken or not communicating or not well developed, you'll fail. So if your company's crisis ready, if your team for your communicators have an effective plan, and if you train people to perform in their roles, then yes, you can respond in that 15 minutes. But this is a little bit of what they have to do. The planning process. I know engineers love the process. So you have to, first of all, we have to make people the priority. Always. Put your people first, put the people impacted first, put people over profit always. And you have to lead with compassion and empathy when you're making these decisions throughout all these phases that we're going to talk about. The first phase is that plan. And so I'm going to just put these up here quickly. We've talked about the authority to activate your plan. It's incredibly important that everyone knows what to do when that crisis hits on your crisis comms team. I've been in EOC drills where I've watched everyone start on social media. But you know what? Only one person was delegated with that job. You need to know who's doing internal media, who's doing external, who's doing social media, who's doing the actual media. You need to have your people delegated into the roles. You need to have a holding statement in there that's legally approved, and you need to include that approval process. So where are people going? How are you managing this? And I saw this happen in an industry in the heartland once about 5 years ago, where they had an event, a fire, and they had to shelter in place their employees. and it happened over shift change, but no information went out for 2.5 hours. The challenge was, of course, now you had all these families concerned about what was going on. People knew there'd been a fire, etc. No information. And when I asked the folks, what happened here? Why didn't you get information, at least on our update line? They had 5 different incident commanders. Only 1 was on call, but 5 came in and everyone was tweaking the message. They didn't have a process written in the book. The process says it goes from comms to here, done. So you can get it out quickly. But everyone was fighting over the wording and they didn't have a plan for the process. So the approval process is key to getting that information out quickly. Of course, your hazards and risk, and all of them, not just the ones that are kind of plant driven. You have to be thinking about cyber attacks, sexual harassment claims, fraudulent use of funds, of donated money, etc. Everything is happening across the board these days. You have to think outside the box of what could happen to you. It might not be a plant or manufacturing related incident. Your message maps, I'm a keen believer in having your key message maps done in advance. Your audiences, how to reach them, and those social media protocols. How are you going to respond in a crisis? What is your role for managing social media? How are you doing that? And of course, those identified spokespersons. So those are all the plan. And I teach whole workshops all day on bringing teams together to write the plan. And here's the thing, it's not just the communications people's jobs. It needs to be holistic. You need to have comms, emergency management, security, EH&S, HR, legal, and a few employees in there as well, helping you look holistically at all of these various scenarios so that all the perspectives coming together give you good solutions. You also need to prepare your team. Sometimes what happens is we have teams that, teams of 1. I was a team of 1 for a few years at Dow, and we had to look inside the organization and identify people who could support the communications team and cross-train them. Do you really need to be a comms professional to be able to escort media or answer or take a media log? No. To monitor media? No. You'll get your direction from a comms person, but they need help. They need minions to help them respond in a crisis. So you need to be looking at training your team, delegating those roles, as we said, and train them to do the roles. If you're giving someone the job of a spokesperson, they need media training. If you're telling someone they're going to be your lead for crisis communication, they need some training. The reality is we make this expectation that every communicator has these skills, but trust me, they don't. It's not taught in post-secondary very often anymore. We graduate people that may have never been on camera and never ever had to be in a crisis scenario. They can't go from their day job and plopped into a crisis and be expected to perform. You wouldn't do that to an incident commander or a planning chief. They get training, ICS training. You need to do the same for your comms team. You have to, in advance here, when you're preparing, gather those messages and products like your news releases. Make sure it's got the right boilerplate on it. Put a template in there for writing messages or media advisories or whatever it is you think you're going to need. Have them all together in advance. You have them now. You just probably don't have them all co-located. You test those messages, as we said, with your external people. And then, as I mentioned, consider that microsite. All of this is done during the preparedness phase when you're preparing to get ready to respond. Now you want to give your team that confidence, and the more you practice and discuss scenarios as a team, the better chances you have at successfully responding to a crisis. So you don't have to always have big exercises or big tabletops. Sometimes this is just a little lunch and learn with your team, walking through a scenario. How would you respond to this? What do you think we would do? Let's talk through our key messages. Host team discussions to get people familiar with the unfamiliar. Participate in tabletops? Absolutely. And play an active role when there's site exercises. I can't tell you how many times I go to a site exercise and nobody has communications actually engaging on social media or playing media for the spokespersons. This is an opportunity to test your leaders as well. It doesn't take rocket science to take your iPhone and just tape an interview. This is how your journalists are doing it today anyways. So tape the interview and play it back for them. It's really inexpensive equipment to buy. It's like $200 to buy a mic, a lapel mic, and a little stand or tripod. It can be done very effectively for very low cost. And review what happens with this. Make sure the drills are realistic. I remember reading that there was a company in Ontario who was an electrical company who dealt with a lot of outages and blackouts, but they always had 2-hour drills. But the time to respond to a blackout was like, 36 hours. So they started running exercises 36 hours. They wanted company people who were responsible and leaders to understand how it was going to be when they couldn't pick up their kids from school, that they had to have a backup plan if they were a key person in that response, management team. They ran them realistically, how people would get tired, how you need to have people to backfill, how you'd need to feed people. It's excellent, but I'm not saying everyone has the ability to do that. I'm just saying when you do a 2-hour drill, everything works perfectly. So put in some things that make it not work so perfectly to make it realistic. And then discuss situations that have happened to others, like that Toronto incident. If this had happened to your group, your company, how would you respond? How would that have gone for you? Would you have kept quiet? Would you have been proactive? Would you have been reactive? Walking through these scenarios are good learnings for us to take on board. Then you want to perform and execute your plan. And the reality is that this plan is your guide. It's going to be tweaked. You're going to have to, not every scenario is going to be, you're going to do perfectly, but it's a bit of a guide and a framework for you. You're going to have to pivot and adjust that plan as needed, but just always remember again to put people first when making some of those decisions, and then at the end, we want to be asking ourselves here, one question I forgot to put on here was, what are we forgetting? What haven't we talked about? That's a great way to end a little meeting of the minds of the incident commander. What haven't we touched on yet? And then Joe is saying, hey, we haven't talked about feeding the people we've evacuated. How's that being managed? Do you know what I mean? I mean, that's kind of maybe a big one, but my point is there's always little things we forget. So let's think about those. Then you want to perfect, right? You want to perfect what you're doing through continuous improvement, a term you're very familiar with here. You want to make sure that you are writing an inclusive after action review that everyone gets a chance to read and put inputs into. You want to make sure if something's not working that you change it, that you fix it, that you adopt. You want to get some feedback from your external audiences. If you have a real event, you want to be asking them, did you hear our messaging? Did it make sense to you? Did you take the actions we asked you to take? Use them as a bit of a focus group and take that constructive criticism when it's warranted and apply it to make your plans stronger. So those are kind of where we're at there. You have these 5 layers of protection that you want to put in place, and you want to also identify your lessons you learned. Now, I will say to you that lessons identified are not lessons learned, because unless you take that identification of that gap, and think about it and review it and log it, change the policy or process you need to, and apply it and test it, it's not learned, right? How many wildfire scenarios and after action reviews have we had sitting on shelves and we haven't learned some of the basic things that are happening year after year after year to some of our communities, because they're lessons identified and no one's learning them. So in our situation, I'm just going to say that's a really integral part of this. You also, when we talk about layers of protection, these are what they are again, that plan and prepare, practice, perform, and perfect. And I'm going to really quickly just give you an overview of a story for a crisis that you're all familiar with, which was 9/11. And this is Rick Rescorla. And basically, this is a gentleman who was the head of, and I have to kind of read my notes here, he was the head of security for a investment firm on 9/11. And basically, from 4 years before that, he was complaining to the Port Authority, who managed emergency management for his buildings, that there was a problem, that they had a problem, that they were not taking the idea of a terrorist attack on civilians seriously. And in 1993, when they had an actual terrorist attack on those buildings, he thought the evacuation went so poorly that he committed, I am changing this. People are not going to die on my watch. And so when he became the head security guy for Dean Witter Morgan Stanley, he basically, and they're located in the buildings of 59 and 74 on one of the towers, so high up in those trade center buildings. And he basically started planning. He started a plan, a communications plan. He started preparing his security people and the people in the building, and he practiced. They hated him for it. Can you imagine trooping down all those steps? Imagine those resistance to those repeated fire drills, and he did them frequently, but they were never fast enough. He would time them. So he started making them leave all their personal gear behind and go down the stairs without high heels. He made the women bring running shoes, change their shoes, and he started training them to go down the stairs, holding onto the shirt of the person in front of them one after the other in the dark, because he said this is going to happen in the dark. So when everything happened on 9/11, the story goes that the Port Authority actually told people to stay in place, stay in situation. And he said, forget that. People are going to die if we do that. He knew the floors above him he couldn't save, but he could save the floors that he was on and below him. And he got his bullhorn and he started to evacuate people. And they went downstairs terrified. Of course, 9/11, everyone knows what's going on. They went down the stairs. He sang songs to keep them motivated. They had done all this training. And at the end of the day, he basically got out, I think they said, I'm just looking for my total here, there was 2,996 employees at the Morgan Stanley and that South Tower Trade Center, and all but 9 made it out alive because of his efforts. Because he planned, he prepared them, he practiced with them, he performed admirably, but he did not get a chance to perfect because sadly he went back into the building to get those people that never left, and he was never seen again. So he's credited to saving almost 3,000 lives that day because the layers of protection he put in place for this public safety. So all of this to say, I think that there is something to be said for when we are looking at this and how we manage that with our people. So really quickly, I'm going to run through most common gaps I've seen in the last 3 years that are happening. I'm invited to lots of events and work with lots of different clients, and these are the top 5 that I see. The first is resourcing and training your comms people. Comms is integral throughout your entire response. But if you're a team of 1, you need others to support you, and your team needs training. Many communicators aren't trained in this area. Get them the training they need. If you're a leader, support them to get this training. The second thing is get that information release process in play. Talk about it, walk through it. Don't make it 50 layers of red tape. What does it look like? How do you do it? Get a little diagram and get it in your plan. Define who's doing what. Clarify those roles and responsibilities. Get people to sign off on their role and responsibilities so they know that if a crisis hits, I'm expecting you to do this job. That's going to make them seek out other training and readings and after action reviews and kind of better understand what responsibility will be on their shoulders in a real crisis. Don't wait to get all the information. You will never have all the information you want before you start communicating. It's unrealistic. That's not how emergencies work or crisis work. They unfold in layers. So you need to run with what you know when you know it and update as you go. You may have to correct information, and that's okay. It's okay to say we didn't have all the correct details before. We've corrected that. This is how we know it right now. This is the information we've received. This is the situation as we understand it at this point in time. We've learned more in details and we're sharing them with you. Always share what you have. Don't hold on to it. Share it when you got it. And remember that, you know, many industries have turned to social media as a way to connect and communicate. But the reality is your audiences, if they can't provide any kind of feedback to you, if there's no feedback loop, then you're informing them. You're not communicating with them. So a Facebook page is a great way, a community page, to get comments, but you need to be monitoring it to make sure you're responding to people. It's a time-consuming task. And it's something that you do have to set up in advance. And remember that if you are using social media, you need your audience before the crisis, right? They're not going to start following, some will start following you, but you want to have that following beforehand. You want to be that trusted, incredible source before the crisis. I know we're kind of running close on time here. Again, I want you to respond as quickly so you own your narrative. Don't let other people tell your story. When a crisis hits, you need to focus up on the event and put all your attention to it until it's resolved. Invest in the insurance of planning, preparing, and practicing with your teams. It is money and time well spent. It will cost you far more to rebuild your brand and reputation than it will to do this preparedness. Trust me. Put people first when making decisions. Clearly, I can't overemphasize that enough. And remember, people only know what actions you're taking to respond to a crisis if you tell them. They have no idea what's going on behind the scenes. They're waiting to get it all from you. So be out there and be proactive. Now that is, I was trying to catch up there because I know we wanted to save time for questions with our little glitches at the beginning. So please know that if there are questions and we don't get to them today, you are welcome to email me at any time with any questions you have, and I'd be more than happy to try to provide a thoughtful response or have a conversation with you. So thank you, CIAC, and thank you for those that logged on for today's webinar on crisis communications, best practices for responding in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Shawna, for that informative presentation, and apologies for those tech problems earlier. I think we all learned something new and useful today, so thank you very much. At this point, I will be reading questions from the Q&A box. I do note that there are none at this point, so feel free to ask more as we in the next few minutes. But I do have a question myself, kind of playing off this virtual environment. How have you had to adjust your crisis communications approach during the pandemic and during this virtual age?
Well, it's been interesting because I think, you know, one of the things that we've talked about that we've seen, and I like to actually, I didn't mention it, and I probably should have, is, you know, we've seen more people taking CEOs or leadership putting personal statements out there. So, you know, they're not having a news conference, they're not bringing media on site, but what they're doing is they're posting a personal statement of what's happening. During Texas's snowstorm, we saw one of the utility companies, the CEO, all the time on his his Facebook pages, doing a daily update, and it was excellent. So I would say that that's one of the ways that people have been pivoting to manage crisis, is to be more engaged with doing the virtual news conference being online. I've also saw in Lytton, we helped put together a town hall for residents. So for example, you know, they couldn't bring everyone together to an area because of COVID. So what they did is they held a town hall meeting with the mayor and public works person and fire chief and went through questions with people. So I think people are pivoting using technology to help manage in ways, and probably in some cases like those town halls, even getting better uptake and participation from it.
Great, thank you. I'm seeing a few questions about if there will be a recording of this webinar, which the answer is yes. We'll send out a link to our YouTube recording following the webinar. Another question is, what are your thoughts on how a communications professional speaks on a crisis versus an operations professional?
Oh, well, that's a hard one because I think there's a very different way that it's done in the US vice Canada. And I worked for, as you know, Dow being a US-based global company. And I think that our job as the PIO, or the way I've trained people, is that my role is to make the other guy look good or gal look good. So I want to have the person in charge talking because that's who the public want to hear talking. You know, public affairs people and communicators are kind of just one step up from the lawyers, right? And no one wants to really hear from them. Sorry, any legal people. But at the end of the day, your job is to get your spokesperson trained to be on camera. That's really different dynamic from what's done in the US, where it's always the public affairs person, I've found. So I would say when I do media training, I'm always saying the communications person plays a key role. If they needed to, absolutely, they would step in and say, yes, I'm running this today because so-and-so is busy. But I really think the focus should be on the leaders. The buck stops with them. They're accountable. They're the leader. They run the site. They're accountable. That's why we pay them the big bucks.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. So that is the last one I see in my question and answer box. But as Shawna said, feel free to direct your questions directly to her following this webinar. So that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank our presenter again for joining us, and all of you. Feel free to check out Shawna's website, www.mdbruceandassociates.com, or reach out to her directly at bruceandassociatesltd@gmail.com. And also feel free to contact me if you have any questions, comments, or concerns about today's webinar, or even if you would like to host your own with CIC to showcase your work. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.